Most people believe that cutting off family is an act of anger. A sudden rebellion. A dramatic overreaction. But in clinical psychology, the most important question is not why someone leaves, it is how long they stayed. Because no one distances themselves from the people who shaped their childhood without first exhausting every internal option to remain. Long before the silence begins, the mind has already been negotiating, rationalizing, and absorbing invisible damage. And when distance finally appears, it often isn't loud or hostile, it's quiet, deliberate, and deeply neurological. What looks like abandonment from the outside may actually be the nervous system's final attempt to breathe. When an individual cuts off their family, psychology urges us to look past the assumption of impulsivity or emotional immaturity. This decision is almost never sudden. It is typically the endpoint of a prolonged psychological process marked by repeated exposure to emotional strain, chronic invalidation, and persistent boundary violations. Over time, the mind and nervous system begin to associate the family environment with distress rather than safety. What makes this process difficult to recognize is that the harm is often subtle. There may be no dramatic episodes of abuse, no single defining incident that outsiders can point to. Instead, there is a slow accumulation of micro-injuries, feelings that are consistently minimized, needs that are ignored, autonomy that is quietly undermined, or expectations that require the individual to abandon parts of themselves to maintain harmony. From a psychiatric standpoint, the nervous system does not differentiate between overt trauma and chronic relational stress. Both activate the same biological pathways. When emotional boundaries are repeatedly crossed, the stress response becomes chronically engaged. Cortisol levels remain elevated, emotional regulation becomes increasingly difficult, and the individual may experience anxiety, irritability, dissociation, or emotional numbness. These symptoms are not signs of weakness, they are signals that the brain is attempting to adapt to an environment it perceives as unsafe. The person may initially try to restore balance by explaining themselves more clearly, suppressing their emotions, or assuming responsibility for the family's emotional state. These strategies often work temporarily, reinforcing the hope that connection can still be preserved. However, when the pattern remains unchanged, the psychological cost of staying begins to outweigh the emotional pain of leaving. At this stage, the nervous system no longer seeks resolution through closeness. It seeks relief through distance. Estrangement becomes a regulatory strategy, a way to reduce ongoing psychological threat. This is why many individuals report a sense of calm or clarity after creating distance, even while simultaneously experiencing grief and guilt. The absence of constant emotional activation allows the nervous system to finally downshift. Importantly, this process is rarely driven by hatred or resentment. More often, those who cut off family have spent years attempting to understand, forgive, and accommodate. Estrangement emerges when the individual realizes that continued contact requires chronic self-abandonment. In psychological terms, this is an untenable condition. A person cannot maintain long-term mental health while repeatedly sacrificing their sense of safety, identity, or emotional integrity. Cutting off family, in this context, is not an act of emotional coldness, it is a survival response shaped by repeated exposure to relational stress that the nervous system can no longer endure. When people cut off their family, it is often assumed that resentment, bitterness, or a desire for revenge is driving the decision. From a psychological perspective, this assumption misses the deeper reality. In many cases, estrangement is not motivated by hatred at all, but by self-preservation. The human mind is wired to seek stability and coherence in identity, and when family relationships repeatedly threaten that stability, distance becomes a protective response. Some individuals grow up in systems where emotional roles are rigid, expectations are inherited rather than chosen, and individuality is subtly discouraged. Over time, maintaining connection requires the person to fragment themselves, to silence certain thoughts, suppress emotions, or abandon personal values in order to belong. Psychologically, this creates internal conflict. The person feels torn between attachment and authenticity. The nervous system experiences this as ongoing threat, because the self is forced into contradiction. Estrangement, in this context, functions as a stabilizing intervention. By stepping away, the individual interrupts patterns that perpetuate emotional harm and gains space to form a more integrated sense of self. This distance is not about erasing family bonds, but about preventing further psychological erosion. Many who cut off family continue to grieve, reflect, and even wish for repair. However, they also recognize that healing cannot occur within the same relational patterns that caused the injury. From this lens, estrangement is less an act of rejection and more an attempt to protect mental integrity and halt the transmission of unresolved pain across generations. Cutting off family is not the absence of love, it is the presence of a limit. When staying requires the destruction of the self, distance becomes an act of survival, not rebellion. Psychology reminds us that protecting mental health is not betrayal, it is responsibility. Sometimes, the strongest boundary a person can set is simply choosing to remain whole.